We need to remember that these young people who all were recruited into the U.S. military machine on a false basis are sitting ducks. It's crystal clear that the U.S. military leadership is prepared to sacrifice these people in the tens of thousands for a war effort against China. I want to talk about the inflection point that we find ourselves in on a global basis. It's all based on a totally discredited and outmoded desire by the U.S. leadership to dominate the world, and its increasing desperate fear that it can't do it anymore. The United States position in the world has eroded very badly. Michael Hudson very often talks about the fact that the decline of Rome is actually reflected and mirrored in the decline of the U.S. empire that has been going on now for several decades, most notably evidenced by the 2008 financial collapse. Some people have forgotten it. It's about 15 years ago, but in fact, the U.S. economy has yet to recover from that collapse, and its share of world trade has continued to fall and fall drastically. And now with de-dollarization and the rise of BRICS, the United States can no longer impose its economic dominance of the world, and it's been essentially reduced to depending only on terrorism, on its own terrorism of military threats and bludgeoning force, while using mafia-style tactics against countries of the global majority to get them to go along with the U.S. aggressive policies against Russia, against the Palestinians, and against China. Now, the vast majority of countries in the world are saying no to that, and that's helping people in the United States to recognize that what the government says is pretty much the opposite of what we need to be thinking and doing. And this, of course, has been largely thanks to China, which has surpassed the U.S. economy and is the world's largest manufacturer and is dedicated to common prosperity and a shared future on a global basis. This is a very big deal for the peoples of the world, but there's a missing ingredient that is really my focus, and that is a movement in my country, the United States, that's strong enough to put a screeching halt to the ever-increasing militarist frenzy of the United States leadership. And it is focused really on taking inspiration and energy from the surge of solidarity with the Palestinians fighting against genocide by Israel, supported by the United States, and merging that with a global anti-war movement to stop the insanity of the U.S. war efforts. Notably, next month in July, there is a very large NATO summit, and our movements in the United States are meeting it with very intensive, united anti-NATO summit that will gather opponents of NATO to highlight that NATO shouldn't even exist. It was founded approximately 70 years ago for the purpose of defending Europe against the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1990. Instead of withering away, NATO has evolved from 12 member countries to, I believe, 30, maybe 31 now. And most recently, they are expanding both membership and military presence in the Far East, obviously aimed against China. Also in July, there's a RIMPAC war games of NATO navies in the Pacific that is going to involve, I believe, more than 24 countries. Many of these countries, especially in Latin America, are themselves long-term victims of U.S. domination and interference of every possible kind. Now there are about 400,000 U.S. sailors and soldiers deployed in the Pacific theater. Most of them are with the U.S. allies in the Far East, South Korea and Japan, especially in its colony Okinawa, but they also have significant base presence in the Philippines and their coordinating center in Hawaii, as well as deployment nodes in San Diego in Southern California, San Francisco Bay Area, as well as in the Seattle area, in the Puget Sound. These are all areas that have a tradition of active duty resistance. The training programs that all of the military branches in the United States use are anti-human, not only physically against the recruits, but also they inculcate a deeply racist culture and brutality in these soldiers that many, many have fought against. There is a GI resistance hotline based on the West Coast that has seen an increase from about 10,000 inquiries a year to about 30,000 inquiries in the most recent period. If we can bring this united front against fascism and militarism as a strengthening force to support these GIs, we will be able to provide the missing ingredient that has made it frustrating, often difficult, if not impossible, for soldiers and sailors to have the courage to say no. They need a strong civilian movement behind it. But when they do have it, as they did, for example, during the Vietnam War period, they can be the critical force that actually disarms the U.S. military machine. I remember very well back in 1969, there was a sanctuary movement in which dozens of U.S. GIs, soldiers and sailors, refused to be deployed to Vietnam. The result was electrifying. It's true that it faced significant military repression, but it also spread like wildfire among the troops. This happened also in San Diego, where the Navy base is very deeply involved in essentially recruiting and staffing the aircraft carriers that they send into the Pacific theater. The same is true in Seattle. We need to remember that these young people who all were recruited into the U.S. military machine on a false basis are sitting ducks. It's crystal clear that the U.S. military leadership is prepared to sacrifice these people in the tens of thousands for a war effort against China that is absolutely crazy. There is no basis a war against China by the United States. Look at the history. The U.S. was only able to fight to a draw against the Korean Liberation Forces and the volunteer Chinese forces during the U.S.-Korea War back in the early 1950s. In Vietnam, they lost completely. They were forced to evacuate the U.S. Embassy by helicopter as their troops and their puppet troops were totally defeated on the battlefield. And they have lost again and again since then in Iraq and Afghanistan, even in Syria, where they tried to topple the government there. And now they've already lost against Russia fighting against NATO expansion in Ukraine, and they're rapidly losing in their support for Israeli genocide against the Palestinians. It's notable that among the most significant solidarity actions with Palestine resistance has been from active duty GIs. One GI burned himself in front of the White House while saying, "Free Palestine," an act of crazy solidarity, but one that genuinely inspired and electrified the anti-war veterans and active duty soldiers. So there is a kind of what you could call dry kindling of a prairie fire that can happen in the United States in opposition to the obvious blunders of the U.S. government in supporting fascism in Ukraine and fascist genocide in Israel. But what we see is the movement against their militarism and imperialism, which has been weak over the last several decades, is suddenly surging and becoming both stronger and more united. And that's what we need to stop the U.S. war machine and to prevent war against China.